The knife clattered across the wooden floor, spinning between two people locked in a moment that would change everything. Clara Whitmore's trembling hand closed around the handle. 5 years of terror, of bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, of screams swallowed in the dark. It all came down to this. Elias lunged forward, drunk and furious, blood on his knuckles. But this time something was different. This time Clara didn't flinch. This is the story of a woman who learned to fight back when the whole world looked away. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The thing about Red Hollow was that everybody knew everything, and nobody said a damn thing about any of it. It was that kind of town, the kind where secrets festered in plain sight, where people shuffled past each other on dusty streets with their eyes trained firmly on their boots. The kind of place where a woman's screams drifted through pine-board walls on Tuesday nights, and by Wednesday morning, folks at the general store would discuss the weather with such determined focus, you'd think their lives depended on it. Maybe they did, in a way. There were codes in towns like Red Hollow, unwritten rules that kept the fragile peace. A man's business was his own. What happened behind closed doors stayed there. And if you heard something you weren't meant to hear, well, you learned real quick how to forget. Clara Whitmore had been screaming for 5 years, and Red Hollow had been forgetting for just as long. She hadn't always been the hollow-eyed woman who moved through town like a ghost. There were people who still remembered her from before Elias, before the wedding, before everything good in her got slowly crushed down into something small and scared. Evelyn Marsh, who ran the mercantile with her husband Thomas, could still picture the younger version of her sister, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, full of plans and dreams that seemed too big for a frontier town. She wanted to be a teacher, Evelyn told Thomas one night, her voice barely above a whisper. They were lying in bed, and through the thin wall that separated their living quarters from the Granger house next door, they could hear Elias shouting, again. Remember? She used to read to the kids at the church on Sundays. She was good at it too. Thomas pulled the pillow over his head. Don't. Don't what? Don't do this to yourself. There's nothing we can do. Evelyn stared at the ceiling, tracking a crack in the plaster that seemed to grow wider every time she looked at it. Something shattered next door. Glass, probably. Clara's voice rose sharp with pain or fear or both, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Tom, Evelyn whispered. I mean it, Ev. You go sticking your nose in, you'll only make it worse for her. And for us. Elias is evil. Dangerous, Thomas corrected, though his tone suggested he didn't necessarily disagree with his wife's assessment. Man like that doesn't take kindly to interference. Sheriff won't do nothing about it neither. You know that. Evelyn did know. She had tried once, 3 years back, when Clara had shown up at the mercantile with her arm hanging wrong and her face so swollen she could barely see. Evelyn had marched straight to Sheriff Morrison's office, righteous anger burning in her chest, demanding he do something. Arrest Elias. Protect Clara. Something. Morrison had leaned back in his chair, boots on his desk, and said, Mrs. Marsh, I understand your concern, but unless your sister wants to press charges, she's terrified of him. Then there's not much I can do. Domestic disputes are complicated. The law, Evelyn had spat, is supposed to protect people. The law says a man has certain rights regarding his wife. Morrison's face had flushed red, defensive. I don't make the rules, ma'am. I just enforce them. She'd left his office shaking with fury and helplessness, and when she'd tried to convince Clara to leave Elias, to run, to do anything, her sister had just looked at her with those dead, empty eyes and said, Where would I go, Ev? Who would take me in? And what do you think he'd do if I tried? That was the thing that kept Clara trapped more securely than any lock. The certainty that running would be worse than staying, because Elias had made it crystal clear in 100 different ways over 5 long years that she belonged to him, that he'd hunt her to the ends of the earth before he'd let her go. I just need to be better, Clara had whispered that day, her voice cracking. If I was a better wife, if I didn't make him so angry. Evelyn had wanted to scream. Instead, she'd held her sister while they both cried, and then Clara had gone back home, and life in Red Hollow had continued its slow, suffocating march forward. That was 2 years ago. Now it was August of 1879, and the heat sat over Red Hollow like a wool blanket soaked in kerosene, heavy and waiting for a spark. The cattle were struggling, the creek was running low, and tempers were shorter than usual. Elias had been drinking more than normal, too, which meant the sounds coming through the walls had gotten worse. Evelyn tried not to listen. She tried to focus on inventory, on customers, on anything else. But every time she heard Clara's voice rise in fear or pain, something inside her twisted tighter. The afternoon it all changed started like any other. It was a Saturday, the town's main street busy with the usual weekend crowd. Farmers in from their homesteads, cowboys stopping through between cattle drives, families doing their weekly shopping. Evelyn was helping Mrs. Chen select fabric when she heard the commotion outside. At first she thought it was just the usual, men arguing over a card game maybe, or a horse spooked by a rattlesnake. Then she heard Clara scream, and the quality of that scream sent ice down her spine despite the sweltering heat. The fabric fell from her hands. She reached the door the same time as half a dozen other people, all of them spilling out onto the street to see what was happening. What they saw stopped them cold. Elias had Clara by the hair, dragging her down the middle of the street. She was fighting him, or trying to, her hands scrabbling at his wrist, her feet struggling for purchase in the dust. He was shouting something about disrespect, about learning her place, his words slurred with whiskey and rage. Clara's dress was torn. Blood trickled from her nose, and her eyes were wild with terror, darting around at all the people watching, silently begging for help that nobody moved to give. "Please," she gasped. "Please, someone—" Elias yanked her head back hard enough that Evelyn heard her sister's neck pop. "Shut your mouth! You want the whole town to see what a worthless, disobedient—" He punctuated the word with a backhanded slap that sent Clara sprawling in the dirt. Evelyn started forward, but Thomas grabbed her arm. "Don't. He's going to kill her. He's drunk and angry. You get in the middle of this, he might kill you too." All around them, people watched. Some looked uncomfortable. A few looked downright horrified. But nobody moved. The same invisible force that had kept them silent for 5 years kept them rooted now, even as Elias hauled Clara up by her arm and hit her again. "This is what happens," Elias announced to the crowd, his voice carrying that peculiar clarity that very drunk people sometimes achieve. "When a woman forgets who's in charge, you're all witnesses. She needed correction. That's enough." The voice cut through the heavy air like a blade, quiet but absolute. Heads turned, searching for the source. A man stepped out from the crowd near the saloon. Evelyn had never seen him before, a stranger, which was notable in itself. Red Hollow wasn't on the way to anywhere. People didn't just pass through. He was tall, lean, wearing trail-dusty clothes and a hat pulled low. A revolver sat easy on his hip, the holster worn smooth from use. But it wasn't the gun that made people take a step back. It was something in the way he moved, deliberate and coiled, like a spring under tension. Elias squinted at him, still gripping Clara's arm tight enough to leave marks. "The hell did you say to me?" "I said that's enough." The stranger's voice remained level, almost conversational. He started walking toward them, slow and steady. "Let her go." A muscle jumped in Elias's jaw. "This is my wife. My business. You got no right." "I got 2 eyes and a conscience. That's right enough." The stranger stopped about 10 feet away, his gaze fixed on Elias with the kind of attention a hawk gives a rabbit. "Let her go." For a long moment, nobody breathed. The whole street had gone silent except for the lazy buzz of flies and Clara's ragged breathing. Even the horses seemed to sense something building, ears flicking nervously. Elias's face went from red to purple. "You don't know who you're messing with, stranger. I run things in this town. I got friends. You got a woman half your size bleeding in the dirt," the stranger interrupted. "And about 30 seconds before I make you regret every choice that brought you to this moment." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Elias shoved Clara away hard enough that she stumbled and fell. She hit the ground with a small cry of pain, but the stranger's eyes never left Elias, not for a second. "You think you're tough?" Elias's hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "You think you can come into my town and tell me what to do with my own wife?" "I think," the stranger said quietly, "that you're the kind of coward who only fights people who can't fight back." And I think you're about to find out what happens when you pick on someone your own size. Later, people would argue about who moved first. Some said Elias drew his knife with a roar and charged. Others swore the stranger had baited him into it, had wanted the fight. But in the moment, it happened too fast for debate. Elias lunged, blade flashing in the afternoon sun. The stranger sidestepped smooth as water, caught Elias's wrist, and twisted. The knife fell. Before Elias could recover, the stranger's fist connected with his jaw with a sound like an axe hitting wood. Elias went down hard. He tried to get up, swinging wild. The stranger blocked, dodged, and delivered a brutal combination: ribs, solar plexus, jaw again. Each hit was precise, calculated to hurt. Elias crashed back into the dirt, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. "Stay down," the stranger advised. Elias didn't. He surged up with a bellow of rage, tackling the stranger around the waist and driving him into the water trough outside the saloon. They went down in a tangle of limbs and flying fists, water sloshing everywhere. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the violence despite themselves. Men shouted encouragement, though it wasn't clear who they were cheering for. Someone called for the sheriff. Nobody seemed inclined to actually stop the fight. Evelyn pushed through the onlookers until she could reach Clara, who was still on the ground, eyes glazed with shock. "Clara, honey, can you hear me?" Clara's gaze slowly focused on her sister's face. "Ev? It's me. Come on, let's get you—" "Who is he?" Claire's voice was barely audible. "Why would he? Nobody ever." "I don't know, baby. I don't know. But let's get you out of the street." Behind them, Elias managed to get the stranger in a headlock, but it only lasted a few seconds before the stranger drove an elbow back into Elias's ribs hard enough to crack something. Elias's grip loosened. The stranger twisted free, spun, and delivered an uppercut that lifted Elias clean off his feet. This time when Elias hit the ground, he stayed there, groaning and spitting blood. The stranger stood over him, breathing hard, knuckles split and bleeding. Water dripped from his hair and clothes. He looked, Evelyn thought distantly, like an avenging angel if angels wore gun belts and had murder in their eyes. "You ever touch her again?" the stranger said, his voice carrying to every person on that street. "And I will kill you. That clear enough for you?" Elias just moaned. The stranger turned to where Evelyn was helping Clara to her feet. His expression softened, just a fraction. "Ma'am, you all right?" Clara stared at him, this impossible man who had done what nobody else in Red Hollow had been willing to do for 5 years. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her face. Her voice broke. You don't have to go back with him." The stranger said it gentle, but firm. "Not if you don't want to." Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Something that might have been hope, or might have been terror at the thought of hoping. Her gaze darted to Elias, still on the ground but starting to stir, and then to the crowd of watching faces. "He'll kill me," she whispered. "If I don't go back, he'll—" "Not while I'm breathing." 4 words. 4 simple words that somehow cut through 5 years of fear and helplessness and convinced Clara that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. She looked at her sister, then back at the stranger, then down at Elias, who was pushing himself up on his elbows, glaring at all of them with such hatred that it seemed to shimmer in the air like heat. "No," Clara said. Her voice shook, but the word came out clear. "I'm not going back with you." The crowd inhaled as one. Elias's face went from purple to nearly black with rage. "The hell you're not! You're my wife! You—" "I said no!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough that Elias actually flinched. "I'm not yours, not anymore, not ever again." For 5 years, Red Hollow had watched Clara Whitmore suffer in silence. They'd heard her screams and seen her bruises and told themselves there was nothing they could do, that it wasn't their business, that interfering would only make things worse. But standing there in the dusty street, watching a broken woman find her voice for the first time, they couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't look away. The weight of their collective guilt pressed down like the heavy August heat, and suddenly several people in the crowd looked sick with shame. Sheriff Morrison finally pushed his way through, hand on his gun, taking in the scene with weary resignation. "Someone want to tell me what in hell happened here? This stranger attacked me." Elias jabbed a finger at the man who'd beaten him. "Unprovoked. I want him arrested." "That's not what happened," said a voice from the crowd. Old man Peterson, who ran the livery stable. Granger was beating his wife in the middle of the street. This fella stopped him. He's lying, Elias snarled. I was disciplining my wife, which is my right, and this man assaulted me. I saw the whole thing, Mrs. Chen called out. Mr. Peterson's right. Mr. Granger was hurting her something awful. More voices joined in, people who'd spent 5 years silent suddenly finding the courage to speak. The sheriff held up his hands, looking tired. All right, everybody calm down. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, maybe for the first time. Saw the blood, the torn dress, the bruises already forming. His jaw tightened. Mrs. Granger, did your husband assault you? Clara opened her mouth, closed it. Years of conditioning told her to lie, to smooth it over, to say she'd fallen, or been clumsy, or that it was her fault. But with Evelyn's hand in hers, and the stranger standing between her and Elias like a human shield, something different came out. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, he did. He hurt me. He's been hurting me for years, and nobody did anything. And I... Her voice broke, but she pushed through it. I want him away from me. I don't want to go back. Please. Sheriff Morrison looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Mr. Granger, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to... The hell I will. Elias struggled to his feet, swaying. She's lying. She's a liar and a whore. And I'll... You'll shut your mouth, the stranger said quietly. Or I'll shut it for you. Sheriff's talking. Morrison shot the stranger a look that might have been gratitude or might have been annoyance, hard to tell. As I was saying, Mr. Granger, you need to come with me. Cool off in a cell until we get this sorted. You can't arrest me for disciplining my own wife. I can arrest you for disturbing the peace and public intoxication. Now you can walk to the jail, or I can drag you there. Your choice. For a moment, Elias looked like he might fight, but between the sheriff's drawn gun and the stranger's cold stare, he must have decided discretion was the better part of valor. He spat blood into the dust and started walking, though he threw Clara a look over his shoulder that promised retribution. This ain't over, he growled. You're still my wife, Clara, still mine, and you'll come crawling back, you'll see. Where else you gonna go? Who else is gonna want damaged goods? Clara flinched like he'd struck her again, but before she could respond, the stranger stepped forward, putting himself directly in Elias's line of sight. Keep walking, he said softly, while you still can. Elias glared at him, then at Clara, then spat again and shuffled off toward the jail with Sheriff Morrison trailing behind. The crowd began to disperse, people drifting back to their business with the uncomfortable energy of folks who'd witnessed something they weren't quite sure how to process. But plenty of them threw glances back at Clara and the stranger, and Evelyn could already hear the whispers starting. Come on, Evelyn said gently, tugging Clara toward the mercantile. Let's get you cleaned up. Clara let herself be led a few steps, then stopped and turned back to the stranger, who was wringing water out of his shirt with an expression of mild annoyance. I don't... Clara's voice was thick with tears and confusion and a dozen other emotions. I don't even know your name. The stranger looked up, meeting her eyes. His face was hard, weathered by sun and wind, and things that left marks deeper than either, but when he smiled, it transformed him into something almost gentle. Caleb, he said. Caleb Ryder. Why? Clara's voice cracked. Why did you help me? Nobody else, for 5 years, nobody. Why would you? Caleb's smile faded, replaced by something darker, older. Pain, maybe. Or memory. Let's just say I know what it looks like when someone needs help and doesn't get it. Figured I'd make sure that didn't happen this time. Before Clara could ask what he meant, Evelyn pulled her sister inside the mercantile and shut the door on the still gawking crowd. The room above the mercantile was small, just a spare bedroom where Evelyn and Thomas kept overflow inventory and the occasional guest. But it had a lock on the door, a window that caught the evening breeze, and most importantly, it wasn't Elias Granger's house. Clara sat on the narrow bed while Evelyn filled a basin with water and gathered clean rags. Her hands were shaking. Everything was shaking. It felt like the floor was tilting under her, like the world had been knocked off its axis, and she couldn't find her balance. I should go back, she said suddenly. I should... He's going to be so angry when they let him out. I need to apologize. I need to... No, Evelyn's voice was sharp as she knelt in front of her sister. No, Clara, you're not going back there. Not tonight. Not ever if I have anything to say about it. But what am I supposed to do? I can't just, where will I? Here, you'll stay here. Evelyn began gently cleaning the blood from Clara's face. We'll figure out the rest later. For now, you're safe. That's what matters. Clara's breath hitched. Am I safe? I mean, he said it's not over. He's not going to just let me. Ev, you don't understand what he's like when he gets really angry. What he's capable of. I have some idea, Evelyn said quietly, dabbing at a cut on Clara's cheekbone. I've been listening through the wall for 5 years, remember? Then you know I can't. I know you're stronger than you think you are. Evelyn sat back on her heels. I watched you survive 5 years with that monster. Don't tell me you can't survive leaving him. Surviving and leaving are different things. Maybe, but you can't do one without the other, can you? Clara didn't have an answer for that. She sat in silence while Evelyn finished cleaning her up, cataloging the damage with practiced efficiency. Split lip, bruised cheek, scrapes on her palms from hitting the street, finger-shaped marks around her upper arm that would bloom into ugly purple flowers by morning. Nothing broken this time. That was something, at least. When Evelyn left to get fresh bandages, Clara found herself at the window, looking down at the street below. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. Most of the shops were closing up for the day. People hurried home for supper, their shadows stretching long behind them. And there, leaning against the post outside the mercantile, was Caleb Ryder. He'd cleaned up some, the water had dried at least, and he'd wiped most of the blood off his knuckles. But he was still there, hat pulled low, apparently content to watch the street and wait. Clara's chest tightened. She didn't understand it, didn't understand him. In her experience, men didn't help unless they wanted something, didn't fight unless there was profit in it, didn't care about a woman they'd never met unless they had ulterior motives. But Caleb Ryder had stepped into the street without hesitation, without knowing her, without anything to gain except trouble. He'd fought Elias, humiliated him in front of the whole town, and then promised to keep her safe. Not while I'm breathing. The words echoed in her head, impossible and terrifying and full of a hope she wasn't sure she could afford. Below, Caleb glanced up as if sensing her watching. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't smile or wave or do anything dramatic, just gave a small nod, the brim of his hat dipping once, and went back to his vigil. Clara stepped away from the window, her heart pounding. She didn't know what was going to happen next. Didn't know if the sheriff would let Elias out tomorrow or next week or next month. Didn't know if she'd be able to stay away from him, or if he'd drag her back, or if this moment of freedom was just a brief illusion before reality came crashing back down. But for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. Downstairs, Thomas locked the front door and pulled the shades, unusual for this time of evening, but warranted given the circumstances. He found Evelyn in the small kitchen behind the store, heating water for tea. How is she? He asked quietly. Scared, confused, about how you'd expect. Evelyn stared at the kettle like it held answers. Tom, we can't send her back there. I'm not suggesting we should. But, Thomas sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. But Elias isn't going to let this go. You know that, right? Morrison can hold him for a day, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Then he'll be out, and he'll be furious, and he'll want his wife back. She's not his wife anymore. Not really. Not after the law says different. Thomas hated the words even as he said them. As far as the law is concerned, she's still married to him. Still his property, more or less. That's not right. No, but it's the way it is. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shade at the street outside. Caleb Ryder was still there, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Who is that man, anyway? I don't know. Nobody does. He just showed up at exactly the right time. Or the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. Evelyn poured hot water into 2 cups. He made Elias look like a fool in front of the whole town. Elias won't forget that. He'll want revenge. Against Clara or against Ryder? Probably both. They stood in silence for a moment, both thinking about the same thing, the long, dangerous road that stretched ahead. Leaving an abusive husband wasn't like walking away from a bad card game or quitting a job you hated. It was declaring war whether you wanted to or not. And wars had casualties. That stranger, Thomas said slowly. Ryder, he any good with that gun he's carrying? I don't know. Why? Because he's going to need to be. Thomas let the shade fall back into place. Elias has friends. Men who drink with him at the saloon, men who owe him money or favors. When he gets out, he's not going to come alone. Evelyn's hand tightened around her teacup. Then we'll need friends too. Who? Name one person in this town who'll stand up to Elias Granger. Caleb Ryder just did. He's one man, Ev, and we don't know a damn thing about him. For all we know, he'll be gone by morning. He's still out there. Thomas looked at his wife, saw the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He'd learned over 15 years of marriage that when Evelyn got that look, there was no point arguing. All right, he said finally. All right. Clara can stay here as long as she needs. We'll help her however we can. But Ev, he caught her hand, held it tight. This is going to get ugly. You understand that? Elias is going to make this as hard and painful as possible. I know. And some people in town are going to side with him. Going to say Clara should go back to her husband, that she's causing trouble, that she's... I don't care. Evelyn's voice was steel. I spent 5 years listening to my sister scream and doing nothing. I'm done looking the other way. Thomas pulled her close, pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to fight. Out in the street, Caleb Ryder leaned against the post and watched the sun disappear behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. His knuckles ached. His ribs hurt where Elias had landed a few good shots. But pain was familiar, almost comfortable. Pain meant you were alive. Pain meant you'd done something that mattered. He'd seen the look in Clara's eyes when she'd stood in that dusty street and said no to her husband. Seen the moment she'd realized she had a choice, even if it was a terrifying one. It was the same look his sister Anne had never gotten the chance to have. Anne, who'd married a man named William Ryder when she was 17 and pretty and full of dreams. William, who'd seemed charming at first, attentive, loving. William, who'd started hitting her 3 months after the wedding and never really stopped. Caleb had been working a ranch 2 states away when it happened. Hadn't known things were bad. Anne never said anything in her letters, never hinted that her husband was slowly destroying her piece by piece. By the time Caleb got word that something was wrong, by the time he rode home as fast as his horse could carry him, it was too late. They'd found Anne in the river. William claimed she'd fallen, hit her head, drowned. But Caleb had seen the bruises, had seen the way William couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes at the funeral, had known deep in his bones that his sister hadn't fallen. She'd been pushed, or maybe she'd jumped, choosing the river over one more day with the man who'd vowed to love and cherish her. Either way, William Ryder had killed her. And when Caleb had gone to the sheriff, demanding justice, he'd gotten the same speech Clara had probably heard a dozen times. Domestic disputes are complicated, no witnesses, no proof, nothing we can do. Caleb had spent 3 months hunting evidence, talking to neighbors, trying to build a case, but small towns protected their own, and William had been well-liked, respected. Nobody wanted to believe he was capable of murder. By the time Caleb finally gave up, William had already remarried, already had his hooks in some other poor woman. Caleb left town before he did something stupid, before he put a bullet in William Ryder and hanged for it. But he'd made himself a promise. If he ever saw someone who needed help the way Anne had needed it, he wouldn't walk away, wouldn't make excuses, wouldn't tell himself it wasn't his business. He'd been drifting for 3 years, working odd jobs, never staying anywhere long. Rode into Red Hollow this morning with no particular plan except to water his horse and maybe find a hot meal. Then he'd seen Elias dragging Clara through the street, and every cell in his body had screamed Anne's name. So he'd done what nobody had done for his sister. He'd stepped up. Now he was committed, for better or worse. And judging by the look on Elias Granger's face when the sheriff had led him away, worse was definitely on the horizon. Footsteps approached from his left. Caleb's hand drifted toward his gun before he recognized the newcomer, a thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and a black medical bag. "Evening," the man said. "Dr. Samuel Wright, you must be the fellow who started all the excitement this afternoon." "Caleb Ryder, and I'd say Elias Granger started it. I just finished it." "Fair enough." Wright leaned against the post beside him, looking up at the windows above the mercantile. "How's Mrs. Granger? I'd like to examine her if she's up to it." You'd have to ask the Marshes. I'm just keeping watch out here. So I see. Wright studied him with the assessing gaze of a man used to reading people. Planning to stand guard all night? If that's what it takes. Elias won't be out of jail until tomorrow at the earliest. Then I'll sleep tomorrow. Caleb pulled his hat lower. Man makes promises, he ought to keep them. Something shifted in Wright's expression. Approval, maybe? You know what you've gotten yourself into here? Some. Elias Granger is a mean drunk and a meaner husband. He's also got connections in this town. Money, friends who'll back his play. Seems like Mrs. Granger could use some friends too. Indeed. Wright was quiet for a moment, then said, I've treated Claire's injuries before. More times than I care to count. I always told myself there was nothing I could do, that it wasn't my place to interfere. I was wrong. He met Caleb's eyes squarely. So if you're serious about helping her, count me in. She's going to need medical documentation of the abuse if she has any hope of getting free legally. You think that's possible? The law helping her? Honestly, I don't know. The laws around marriage are antiquated. Cruel, really. But there are judges who'll grant divorces for extreme cruelty if the evidence is strong enough. It's a long shot, but it's better than nothing. Caleb nodded slowly. Every battle starts with long odds. Doesn't mean you don't fight. No, Wright agreed. It doesn't. He tipped his hat. I'll go see if Mrs. Marsh will let me examine Clara. You take care out here, Mr. Ryder. Doc? Wright paused. You got a gun? I'm a doctor. I save lives, not take them. Might want to reconsider that philosophy, at least temporarily. Caleb's voice was flat, serious. This situation is going to get worse before it gets better. And when Elias comes looking for blood, he won't much care who's in the way. Wright's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Duly noted. After the doctor disappeared inside, Caleb settled in for a long night. The street gradually emptied as Red Hollow bedded down for the evening. Lamps winked out in windows. The saloon down the street stayed bright and noisy for a while, then quieted. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. And Caleb Ryder stood his post, watching the shadows, waiting for trouble. Because trouble was coming. As sure as the sun would rise tomorrow, Elias Granger would come for his wife. And when he did, he'd find Caleb waiting. Not while I'm breathing. It wasn't just a promise to Clara. It was a promise to Anne, who'd never gotten a stranger in the dust to save her. Who'd died alone and scared and convinced nobody cared enough to help. Caleb couldn't save his sister. But maybe, just maybe, he could save someone else's. And if that meant standing between Clara Whitmore and the devil himself, well, he'd stood in worse places for worse reasons. The night stretched out before him, full of possibility and danger, and Caleb Ryder didn't move an inch. Morning came too soon, dragging with it a headache and the sharp clarity that follows a sleepless night. Clara woke in the unfamiliar bed above the mercantile, disoriented for the first few seconds before memory crashed back. The street. Elias's fists. Caleb Ryder's quiet voice cutting through years of silence. She sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. The mirror across the room showed her what she already knew. Her face was a mess. The bruise on her cheek had ripened overnight into something dark and ugly. Her lip was swollen. Finger marks decorated her throat like a terrible necklace. This was nothing new. She'd woken up looking worse. What was new was the absence of Elias sleeping in the next room. The absence of fear that he'd wake up angry and start the whole cycle again. The silence felt wrong, like wearing someone else's clothes. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. "It's just me," Evelyn called. "Can I come in?" Yes. Her sister entered carrying a tray with coffee and toast. "Thought you might be hungry. How are you feeling?" "Like I got trampled by a horse." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully. "Where's Thomas?" "Downstairs opening the store. It's almost 9. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. "That stranger, Caleb, he stood outside all night. Didn't move once that I could see. Thomas tried to relieve him around 3 in the morning, but he refused." Clara's hands tightened around the cup. "Why would he do that?" "I don't know, but I'm glad he did." Evelyn paused. "Dr. Wright came by last night. He wants to examine you, document your injuries. Says it could help if you decide to leave Elias officially." "Leave him." Clara tested the words like they might burn her tongue. "As in divorce?" It's possible. Dr. Wright knows a territorial judge who's granted divorces for cruelty before. It's not easy, and it's not guaranteed, but Elias will never let me go? He doesn't get a choice, Clara. Not if a judge says, "You don't understand." Clara set the coffee down before she spilled it. Her hands were shaking again. The law judges? None of that matters to Elias. He'll kill me before he lets me walk away. He's said it before. If you ever leave me, one of us ends up dead. He meant it. Evelyn took her sister's trembling hands. Then we make sure it's not you. Before Clara could respond, raised voices drifted up from downstairs. Male voices, angry. Both women froze. "Stay here," Evelyn said, standing. "Ev, don't!" But her sister was already gone, footsteps quick on the stairs. Clara moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "My wife, and I got every right to see her?" That was Elias, his voice loud and aggressive even through the floorboards. "Sheriff let you out already?" Thomas's voice, trying for calm but wavering slightly. "Damn right he did. Couldn't hold me on bogus charges. Now where is she?" "She doesn't want to see you." That was Caleb Ryder, his tone flat and final. "I wasn't asking you, stranger. This is between me and my wife." "Your wife said no. That makes it everybody's business." "The hell it does. You got no legal standing here. Clara belongs to me. We're married, which means which means nothing if she doesn't want to be married anymore." Caleb again, still calm, but Clara could hear steel underneath. "She's not property, Granger. She's a person. A person who took vows, who swore before witnesses to obey me. I'm her husband." "You're her abuser." Dr. Wright's voice joined the mix, clinical and cold. "I've treated injuries you gave her for 5 years, broken bones, concussions, lacerations. That's not marriage, Granger. That's assault." A crash, something hitting the floor or a wall. Clara's breath stopped. "You calling me a criminal in my own town?" "It's not your town." Sheriff Morrison sounding tired. "And yes, Granger, what you did yesterday was criminal. Assault and battery in front of witnesses. You're damn lucky I'm not charging you." "She's my wife." "That's not a license to beat her senseless." Morrison's voice rose, patience clearly fraying. "Now I'm telling you one time, Mrs. Granger doesn't want to see you. You need to leave." "I'm not going anywhere without her." "Then I'll arrest you for trespassing and disturbing the peace." Morrison paused. "Don't test me on this, Elias. I mean it." A long, dangerous silence followed. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She knew that silence. It was the one that came right before Elias exploded. "This ain't over," Elias finally said. His voice dropped to something quieter and infinitely more threatening. "Clara, you hear me up there? This ain't over. You're still mine, and you will come home." Clara backed away from the door, wrapped her arms around herself. Even with the floor and several people between them, his voice still had the power to make her small. "Get out," Caleb said. "Now." "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Elias let out a bitter laugh. "Playing night for a woman you don't even know. But you'll get tired of it, stranger. You'll move on. And when you do, she'll have nobody. She'll realize she made a mistake, defying me in front of the whole town, and she'll come crawling back. They always do. Keep believing that." Caleb's voice was soft as a knife sliding from a sheath. "Might make what's coming easier for you." "That a threat?" "Just a fact. You touch her again, you even look at her wrong, and I will end you. We clear?" Another pause, then footsteps stomping toward the door. It slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Minutes later, Evelyn returned, her face pale but determined. "He's gone. For now." "He'll be back." "Probably. But, Clara—" Evelyn gripped her shoulders, forcing eye contact. "You're not alone anymore. You've got me, Thomas, Dr. Wright. That Caleb fellow seems determined to help. The sheriff's finally paying attention. We're going to get you through this." Clara wanted to believe her, wanted to feel the hope those words were meant to inspire. But 5 years with Elias had taught her that hope was just another thing he could take away. Still, she nodded. "What do I do now?" "Now? You let Dr. Wright document your injuries. We start building a case, and we figure out how to keep you safe while we do it." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was more than Clara had ever had before. The examination was worse than the beating. Dr. Wright was gentle and professional, but having someone catalog every mark Elias had left on her body over the years felt like being flayed open. He photographed the bruises with a new camera he'd ordered from back east, explaining that visual evidence could be powerful in court. "This break here," he said, touching her wrist carefully, "it didn't heal properly." "When did this happen?" 2 years ago. Maybe 3. Clara swallowed. "He slammed a door on my hand, said I was taking too long with supper." Wright made a note. "And this scar on your shoulder?" "Fireplace poker, I spilled his coffee." More notes. More photographs. Each injury had a story, and telling them out loud made Clara feel simultaneously liberated and sick. These things had happened. They were real. She hadn't imagined them or deserved them or brought them on herself, no matter how many times Elias had told her otherwise. "That's enough for today," Wright finally said, his expression grim. "I have what I need. Mrs. Granger, Clara, I want you to understand something. What he did to you, what he's been doing, it's not normal, it's not acceptable, and it's not your fault." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm going to write to Judge Burke in the territorial capital. He's presided over divorce cases before, and he's sympathetic to women in your situation. With this documentation and witness testimony, we have a real chance." "How long will it take?" "Weeks, possibly months. The judge has to review the petition, set a hearing date, travel here if he decides to take the case." Wright began packing his medical bag. "In the meantime, you need to stay somewhere safe, somewhere Elias can't reach you." "She's staying here," Evelyn said firmly from the doorway, "as long as she needs." Wright nodded. "Good. Mr. Ryder, he planning to stick around?" "Haven't asked him," Thomas said. "Man doesn't talk much about his plans." "Someone should, because Elias won't quit. He'll escalate. And when he does, Clara's going to need all the protection she can get." After Wright left, Clara stood at the window again, looking down at the street. Caleb was back at his post despite the morning sun already beating down. He'd acquired a chair from somewhere, but didn't look any more comfortable. His hat was pulled low, his posture alert. She watched him for a long moment, this stranger who'd upended her entire world in the space of 5 minutes. He looked tired. Probably was tired after standing guard all night, but he didn't move, didn't abandon his post. "Not while I'm breathing." Clara pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the heat radiating through. She didn't know how to process what was happening. For 5 years, survival had meant making herself smaller, quieter, less. Anything to avoid setting Elias off. The idea of fighting back, of actually leaving, felt impossible. But Caleb Ryder had stepped between her and Elias's fists without hesitation. Dr. Wright was documenting evidence for a divorce case. Even Sheriff Morrison, who'd ignored her for years, had thrown Elias out of the mercantile. Things were changing. The question was whether Clara could change with them, or if 5 years of conditioning had broken something in her that couldn't be fixed. Below, Caleb glanced up. Their eyes met again, and this time Clara didn't look away. By afternoon, word had spread through Red Hollow like wildfire. Clara Granger had left her husband. Some stranger had beaten Elias bloody in the street. The sheriff had arrested him. Dr. Wright was building a divorce case. The town's response split cleanly down the middle. In the saloon, a group of men who drank with Elias muttered about outsiders interfering in private matters. "Man's got a right to discipline his wife," said Jack Crawford, who worked at the lumber mill. "Granger might have been rough, but that's between him and Clara." "I saw what he did," countered Old Man Peterson. "That wasn't discipline. That was cruelty." "You getting soft in your old age, Peterson? Since when do we let strangers come in here and tell us how to run our lives? Since one of those strangers stopped a woman from getting beaten to death in the middle of town." The argument escalated from there, voices rising, positions hardening. By the time Sheriff Morrison walked in to break it up, the divide was clear. Some people thought Clara was causing trouble by refusing to submit to her husband. Others were finally willing to admit they'd stood by and watched abuse happen for far too long. The women of Red Hollow had their own discussions, quieter but no less intense. Some sympathized with Clara. Others worried about setting a dangerous precedent. "If wives can just leave their husbands for any reason," Mrs. Patterson said over tea at the general store, "what's to stop them all from walking out? Marriage is sacred. You make vows." "Those vows include to love and cherish," Mrs. Chen replied sharply. "Elias Granger has done neither." I've seen Claire's bruises with my own eyes. Are we supposed to just accept that? I'm not saying it's right, but then what are you saying, Martha? That Clara should go back to a man who beats her? That she deserves it somehow? Of course not. I'm just saying it's complicated. It's not complicated, Evelyn said, joining the conversation. My sister has been suffering for 5 years while this town looked the other way. Now someone finally helped her, and half of you are acting like she's the problem. We're concerned about you too, Evelyn, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice softening. Elias is angry. He's making threats. You and Thomas could get caught in the crossfire. Then maybe someone should arrest him for making threats instead of telling Clara to go back to her abuser. The room fell silent. Several women looked uncomfortable, unable to meet Evelyn's eyes. I thought so, Evelyn said quietly, then turned and walked out. The conversation continued without her, but the fault lines had been drawn. Red Hollow was no longer a town that could pretend domestic violence wasn't their business. Clara's refusal to go back had forced everyone to choose a side, and choosing sides meant consequences. That night, someone threw a rock through the mercantile window. It crashed through the glass around midnight, sending shards scattering across the floor. Thomas ran downstairs with his rifle, while Evelyn rushed to Clara's room to make sure she was safe. Caleb was off his post in seconds, scanning the street for movement. He caught sight of a figure running toward the edge of town and took off after them, boots pounding against the dirt. The runner was fast, but Caleb was faster and considerably more motivated. He caught up near the livery stable, tackling the man into the dust. They struggled briefly before Caleb got him pinned. Who sent you? Caleb demanded, arm pressed across the man's throat. Nobody, Granger said. The man was young, barely 20, and scared. He said someone needed to send a message. I didn't mean, I was just supposed to scare them. By throwing rocks through windows in the middle of the night? I'm sorry, please don't hurt me. Caleb hauled him up by his collar and marched him back toward the mercantile, where Thomas and Sheriff Morrison were surveying the damage. Found your vandal, Caleb said, shoving the young man forward. Says Granger put him up to it. Morrison grabbed the kid by his shoulder. That true, Danny? Danny, who worked as a stable hand and had exactly 2 thoughts in his head on a good day, nodded miserably. Mr. Granger bought me drinks and said the Marshes needed to learn not to interfere. Said if they were scared enough, they'd send Mrs. Granger back where she belongs. I didn't think, it's just a window. It's property damage and intimidation, Morrison said, his jaw tight. And now I'm going to have to arrest you and have another conversation with Elias Granger about leaving these people alone. He's going to kill me, Danny whimpered. Should have thought of that before you started taking orders from him. Morrison looked at Thomas. I'll pay for the window replacement. This is on me. I should have seen this coming. It's not your fault, Sheriff, Thomas said, though his expression suggested he partly blamed Morrison anyway. But you need to do something about Elias before this gets worse. I know. I'm working on it. Morrison dragged Danny toward the jail, leaving Caleb and Thomas to board up the broken window. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammering loud in the quiet street. Finally, Thomas said, Thank you for catching him, for staying. Caleb shrugged. Not doing anything special. Yes, you are. Thomas drove another nail home. Most people would have moved on by now. This isn't your fight. Became my fight the moment I stepped into that street. Why did you? Step in, I mean. You didn't know Clara. Didn't owe us anything. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, measuring how much truth to share. Had a sister once. Her husband beat her. Nobody helped. She died. He fitted another board across the window frame. Swore I wouldn't let that happen again if I could stop it. Thomas absorbed this, understanding dawning in his eyes. I'm sorry. About your sister. Me too. Caleb hammered harder than necessary. But being sorry doesn't change what happened. Action does. And you think we can actually win this? Get Clara free? I think we don't have a choice but to try. Inside the mercantile, Clara and Evelyn had heard the whole exchange. Clara sat on the stairs, arms wrapped around herself, trying to process the fact that Caleb Ryder's sister had died the way she'd been slowly dying for years. He wasn't just helping her out of general goodness. He was trying to save someone he'd already lost. The weight of that realization settled over her like a heavy coat. You should talk to him, Evelyn said softly. And say what? Thank you for making my problems yours? Sorry your sister died? Maybe just thank you. That's a start. Clara didn't respond. She wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Wasn't ready to look Caleb in the eye and see his sister's ghost staring back at her. The next morning, Dr. Wright received a response to his telegram faster than expected. Judge Nathaniel Burke was willing to hear Clara's case, but he couldn't travel to Red Hollow for at least 6 weeks. In the meantime, Clara would need to file a formal petition for divorce citing specific grounds: cruelty, abandonment, or adultery, Wright explained, sitting in the Marsh's kitchen with Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas. Those are the legal grounds for divorce in the territory. In your case, we're going with cruelty, supported by medical documentation and witness testimony. Who would testify? Clara asked, her voice small. Me, for one. I can describe your injuries in medical terms. Evelyn and Thomas can testify about what they've heard and seen. Sheriff Morrison might be willing to speak to the complaints you've filed over the years. I only filed 2 complaints. He never did anything about them, which is relevant information the judge should hear. Wright pulled out a legal form. I've drafted the initial petition. You'll need to sign it, and then we file it with the territorial court. Clara stared at the paper like it might bite her. Filing this petition meant no going back. Meant declaring war on Elias in a way that couldn't be undone. It meant trusting the legal system to protect her, trusting a judge she'd never met to believe her story over Elias's denials. What if he says no? Clara whispered. The judge. What if he decides I haven't proven enough, or that Elias deserves another chance, or then we appeal, Wright said firmly. And if that doesn't work, we find another way. But Clara, you have to try, because staying in this limbo isn't sustainable. Elias isn't going to give up. He's going to keep pushing, keep threatening, until something breaks. I know. Clara picked up the pen, her hand shaking. I've never defied him before. Not really. This feels like stepping off a cliff. It is, Evelyn said quietly, but we'll be there to catch you. Clara looked at the 3 people sitting around the table, all of them risking Elias's wrath to help her. Then she thought about Caleb outside, standing guard even though his knuckles were still bruised and his ribs probably ached. Thought about his sister, who'd never gotten this chance. She signed her name at the bottom of the petition, each letter feeling like a small act of rebellion. Good, Wright said, witnessing the signature. I'll file this today. Once Elias is served with the petition, he'll have 2 weeks to respond. That's when things might get difficult. Might? Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Doc, things are already difficult. They're going to get worse. When Elias realizes Clara is serious about leaving, when he understands the legal system is actually going to hear her case, he'll panic. Panicked men do desperate things. Which is why we need a better plan than Caleb standing outside indefinitely, Evelyn said. No offense to him, but one man can't guard us forever. I've been thinking about that, Sheriff Morrison said from the doorway. They all jumped, not having heard him come in. Sorry, door was open. Thomas, Evelyn, I know I haven't done right by your sister, by any of you. I let the situation go on far too long because it was easier to look the other way. Sheriff, let me finish. Morrison took off his hat, turning it in his hands. I'm not making excuses. What I didn't do, was wrong. But I'm trying to fix it now. I've deputized 2 men to help keep watch on this building, and I've had a conversation with Elias about consequences if he tries anything else. How'd that go? Thomas asked skeptically. About as well as you'd expect. He threatened to have me removed from office, said I was taking sides in a private matter. But the thing is, this stopped being private the moment he dragged Clara into the street and beat her in front of witnesses. Morrison's expression hardened. I've got 5 written complaints from the past week about his behavior. He's been drinking heavily, making threats, harassing people who've expressed support for Clara. If he steps 1 foot out of line, I'll arrest him again, and this time I'll find charges that stick. Clara found her voice. Why now? Why are you helping now when you wouldn't before? Morrison met her eyes, and she saw genuine shame there. Because I watched you stand up to him in that street, Mrs. Granger. Watched you say no when I know how terrified you were. If you can find that kind of courage after everything you've been through, the least I can do is my damn job. It wasn't enough. Couldn't erase 5 years of ignored pleas for help, but it was something. Thank you, Clara said quietly. After Morrison left, Dr. Wright gathered his papers. The petition will be filed by end of day. Elias will be served tomorrow. Be ready for his reaction. We will be, Evelyn promised. But none of them really knew how to prepare for what was coming, because Elias Granger, faced with the reality of losing control, was about to become more dangerous than any of them had imagined. That evening, Caleb finally took a break from his post. Thomas had convinced him to at least eat a hot meal and rest for a few hours while the deputized men kept watch. He sat at the Marshes' kitchen table, working his way through beef stew and biscuits, while Evelyn fussed around him. "You need sleep," she said. "Proper sleep. In a bed." "I've slept in worse places than a chair." "That's not the point." Evelyn sat across from him. "You can't keep this up indefinitely. You'll collapse." "I'll manage." "Mr. Ryder, Caleb, we appreciate everything you're doing, truly. But this situation could go on for months. You can't stand guard every single day until the divorce is finalized." Caleb pushed his empty bowl away. "What else am I supposed to do? Leave Clara unprotected?" "No, but—" Evelyn hesitated. "Do you even have work? A place to stay? You rode into town 3 days ago and immediately planted yourself outside our store. That's not sustainable. I've got savings, and I don't need much." "Everyone needs something, Mr. Ryder." She studied him carefully. "Why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's just about your sister. There's more to it." Caleb was silent for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "When Anne died, I spent 3 months trying to get justice for her. Talked to sheriffs, lawyers, judges. Every single one of them told me the same thing. No proof, no witnesses, nothing they could do. Her husband was free to remarry, free to hurt someone else, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. So this is about redemption. This is about not being useless." Caleb's voice roughened. "I couldn't save Anne, but Clara's still alive, still fighting. Long as that's true, I'm staying." Footsteps on the stairs made them both look up. Clara stood in the doorway, dressed in one of Evelyn's borrowed nightgowns, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, more fragile. "I heard what you said," she told Caleb. "About your sister. I'm sorry. Not your fault." "I know, but I'm still sorry." Clara moved into the room slowly, like approaching a wild animal. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why do you think I'm worth saving? You don't know me. Don't know if I'm a good person, or if I deserve help, or—" "Nobody deserves what Elias did to you," Caleb interrupted. "Nobody. Good person, bad person, doesn't matter. What he did was wrong. That's all I need to know." "But you're risking your life. Elias is going to come after you eventually." "Let him. You could die. So could you, if someone doesn't help." Caleb stood, his chair scraping back. "Look, Mrs. Granger, Clara, I'm not asking you to understand my reasons. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just here until you're safe. That's it." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to be safe. I've been scared for so long, I don't remember what it feels like not to be." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, the hard edges softening just slightly. "Then maybe it's time you learned." The petition was served to Elias Granger on a Tuesday morning while he was drinking his breakfast at the saloon. Sheriff Morrison handed him the papers personally, watching his face turn from confusion to rage as he read Clara's formal request for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty. "This is bullshit," Elias snarled, crumpling the papers in his fist. "She can't divorce me. I don't consent." "You don't have to consent," Morrison said evenly. "Judge Burke will hear the case in 6 weeks. You'll have the opportunity to present your side." "My side? My side is that she's my wife, and she belongs at home, not hiding above some store like a coward." Elias threw the wadded papers at Morrison's feet. "This is that stranger's doing. He's been poisoning her mind against me. Or maybe she just got tired of you beating her." Elias's hand shot across the bar, grabbing Morrison by his shirt. "You watch your mouth, Sheriff. I still got friends in this town. People who remember when you were nothing but a drunk deputy barely able to stand up straight. One word from me and—" Morrison knocked his hand away, hard. "And nothing, Granger. Those days are gone. You threaten me again, I'll arrest you for assault on an officer. Test me." For a moment, violence hung in the air between them, thick and ready to ignite. Then Elias stepped back, his mouth twisted in something that might have been a smile or a snarl. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "All of you. Clara, those Marshes, That cowboy playing hero. You'll all regret crossing me. That a threat? That's a promise. Morrison left before things could escalate further, but the conversation troubled him enough that he went straight to the mercantile to warn them. He found Caleb on the porch, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. He's been served, Morrison said without preamble. Didn't take it well. Caleb didn't look up from his whittling. Figured he wouldn't. He made threats. Specific ones. You need to be ready for retaliation. I'm always ready. Caleb brushed wood shavings off his lap. Question is whether you are. He goes after Claire again. Are you going to arrest him for real this time? Or give him another warning? Morrison's jaw tightened. I'm doing my job. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, Granger's been breaking laws for years and you've done exactly nothing about it. I'm trying to make that right. Trying isn't the same as doing. Caleb finally looked up, his eyes flat and unforgiving. You want redemption, Sheriff? Earn it. Stop talking about what you should have done and start actually protecting the woman who needed you 5 years ago. Morrison opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because Caleb was right, and they both knew it. I've got 2 deputies watching the building at night. I'll increase patrols during the day. If Granger so much as looks at this place wrong, I'll haul him in. Make sure you do. Caleb went back to his whittling, dismissing Morrison as effectively as if he'd slammed a door. Inside, Clara was learning to sew again. Her hands, once skilled at needlework, had grown clumsy from years of shaking and fear. Evelyn sat beside her, patiently guiding her through a simple hem repair. You used to make the most beautiful dresses, Evelyn said softly. Remember that green one you made for the harvest dance? Everyone said it looked like something out of a magazine. That was a long time ago. Clara's stitches were uneven, childlike. She pulled them out with a frustrated noise. I can't even do this anymore. He took everything, Ev. Even my hands don't work right. They will again. You just need practice. What if I can't get it back? What if he broke something in me that won't heal? Evelyn set down her own sewing and took Clara's hands in hers. Listen to me. Elias hurt you, scared you, made you feel small and useless. But he didn't break you, Clara. You're still here. You're still fighting. That proves you're stronger than he ever was. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about feeling brave. It's about being terrified and doing the thing anyway. Evelyn squeezed her hands. You signed that petition even though you were scared. You said no to him in front of the whole town. That's strength. Clara wanted to believe her. Wanted to feel the power in those words instead of just the fear that came with every decision she made. But 5 years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight, and the voice in her head that sounded like Elias kept whispering that she was making a mistake, that she'd regret this, that she deserved whatever punishment was coming. A knock at the door made her jump. Evelyn called out, Who is it? Mrs. Chen, came the reply. I brought something for Clara. Evelyn let her in, and the older woman entered carrying a basket covered with cloth. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder like she expected to be followed. I can't stay long, Mrs. Chen said quickly. My husband doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I shouldn't get involved, but... She pulled back the cloth to reveal fresh bread, preserves, and a small jar of honey. I wanted you to know that some of us support you. What you're doing, leaving Elias, it's brave. My mother was in a marriage like yours, back in China. She never got out, never got the chance to be free. Her eyes glistened. So I wanted to help, even if I have to do it quietly. Claire's throat tightened. Thank you. There are others too, women who can't speak up publicly because their husbands or fathers wouldn't approve, but they're on your side. They're watching what happens to you, hoping you make it. Mrs. Chen touched Clara's shoulder briefly. Don't give up. We need you to win this. After she left, Clara stared at the basket with tears streaming down her face. She hadn't realized she was carrying the weight of other women's hopes along with her own fear. The responsibility of it felt crushing and empowering at the same time. You see, Evelyn said gently, you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. The days that followed were tense with waiting. Elias didn't attack again, but his presence hung over Red Hollow like a thundercloud. He spent most of his time at the saloon, drinking and muttering to anyone who'd listen about his unfaithful wife and the stranger who'd stolen her. His friends, men who valued loyalty over morality, began making their own threats. Jack Crawford confronted Thomas outside the general store one afternoon. You're making a mistake, Marsh. Granger's a good customer, good friend. You keep harboring his wife, you're going to lose business. People remember who their real friends are. Thomas, who'd been unloading crates, set down the box he was carrying and faced Crawford squarely. My real friends don't beat women. If I lose customers over protecting my sister-in-law from a man who broke her arm for spilling coffee, then I'll sleep fine at night. High and mighty all of a sudden, aren't you? You didn't care so much when it was convenient to look the other way. The words hit home because they were true. Thomas had spent 5 years hearing Clara's screams through the wall and doing nothing. The guilt of that sat in his chest like a stone. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have helped her sooner, should have stood up to Elias years ago, but I'm standing up now, and I'm not backing down." Crawford spat in the dirt. "We'll see how long that lasts when your business goes under." It wasn't an idle threat. Over the next week, several of the Mercantile's regular customers stopped coming. Men who'd traded there for years suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. The silent boycott hit the Marsh's finances hard, but neither Thomas nor Evelyn complained. Some things, they decided, were more important than money. Caleb noticed the decrease in customers. "They're trying to starve you out," he said one evening, watching another potential customer cross the street to avoid entering the store. "Let them try," Evelyn said, restocking shelves with determined efficiency. "We've got savings. We'll manage." "For how long?" She didn't answer because they both knew the truth. If the boycott continued, the Mercantile would fail within a few months. Elias was waging economic warfare, and it was working. "I should leave," Clara said from the doorway. She'd been listening, her face pale. "I'm ruining your lives, your business, everything. If I just went back—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence," Evelyn cut her off. "You're not going back to him. Ever. We'll figure out the money." "But, no." Evelyn's voice was steel. "I would rather lose the store than lose you. Do you understand me, Clara? I would rather lose everything than send you back to that monster." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, Caleb spoke up. "There might be another option." They all turned to look at him. "I've been talking to some of the ranchers outside town," he continued. "Old man Harrison needs help with his cattle operation. He's willing to hire me on, and he doesn't give a damn about Granger's politics. Pays decent. I could contribute to household expenses, make up for some of the lost business." "You don't have to do that," Thomas said. "I know, but I'm doing it anyway." Caleb shrugged. "Can't stand guard every hour of every day. Might as well be useful when I'm not here." The arrangement started the next day. Caleb would work at Harrison's ranch from dawn until mid-afternoon, then return to town to resume his watch at the Mercantile. It was exhausting, but he'd worked harder jobs for worse reasons. And Harrison, a gruff old man who'd lost his own daughter to pneumonia years ago, understood what Caleb was trying to do. "You're protecting that Granger woman," Harrison said, more statement than question. "Yes, sir." "Good. Elias Granger's a mean son of a bitch. Someone should have put him in the ground years ago." Harrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "You need anything? Extra hands, a place to stay, ammunition? You let me know." It was the first offer of concrete support from anyone with real resources, and Caleb felt some of the weight on his shoulders ease slightly. He wasn't in this alone anymore. The problem was that Elias wasn't alone either. 3 weeks after the petition was served, the situation escalated. It started with small things. Someone poisoned the Marsh's dog, a sweet-tempered mutt named Ranger, who'd never hurt anyone. Evelyn found him convulsing in the alley behind the store and held him while he died, tears streaming down her face. There was no proof it was Elias, but everyone knew. Then their supply shipment from the capital went missing. The freight company claimed it had been delivered, but the goods never arrived. More lost money. More pressure. Graffiti appeared on the Mercantile's boarded-up window one night, Whore's Refuge in dripping paint. Sheriff Morrison had it cleaned off, but the message was clear. Clara stopped sleeping. She'd lie awake listening to every creak and rustle, convinced Elias was coming for her. Evelyn found her one night standing at the window with a kitchen knife clutched in her hand, staring down at the empty street. "He's going to kill me," Clara whispered. "I know he is. This is all just him playing with us before he strikes." Caleb won't let that happen. Caleb can't be everywhere, and Elias is patient when he wants to be. He'll wait for the right moment, and then... Her voice cracked. "I should never have filed that petition. I should have just stayed quiet." "And what? Lived the rest of your life being beaten?" Evelyn pulled her sister away from the window. You did the right thing, the hard thing. Now you have to see it through. But seeing it through was becoming harder every day. The weight of constant fear, constant vigilance, was wearing them all down. Even Caleb, who seemed unflappable, looked exhausted. The combination of ranch work and night watches was taking its toll. Dr. Wright noticed when he came by to check on Clara. "You need rest," he told Caleb bluntly. "Real rest. You keep this up, you're going to collapse." "I'm fine." "You're running on fumes and stubbornness. That's not sustainable." Wright's voice softened. "I understand why you're doing this, but you can't save anyone if you're dead on your feet." "What's your suggestion, Doc? Leave her unprotected?" "My suggestion is that we need more people involved. This can't all rest on your shoulders." Wright looked at the others. "We need to organize. Create a real protection plan instead of relying on one exhausted man and 2 deputies who patrol sporadically." "How?" Thomas asked. "Most of the town's either with Elias or too scared to get involved. Then we find the ones who aren't." Wright pulled out a piece of paper. "I've been keeping a list. People who've expressed support for Clara, even privately. It's not a long list, but it's something." The list had 12 names, 12 people in a town of over 200 who were willing to publicly stand against Elias Granger. It wasn't much, but Wright was right. It was something. They organized a meeting at the Marshes' home, gathering late one night when the streets were empty. The 12 supporters came through the back door one by one, looking nervous but determined. "We all know why we're here," Dr. Wright said, addressing the small group. "Clara Granger has filed for divorce from an abusive husband. That husband is retaliating, trying to force her back through intimidation and economic pressure. We're here to make sure that doesn't happen." "How?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Elias has more supporters than we do." "Numbers aren't everything. What we lack in quantity, we make up for in being right." Wright gestured to Clara, who sat in the corner looking overwhelmed. "This woman has suffered for 5 years while we did nothing. Some of us ignored it. Some of us didn't know how to help. But we all bear some responsibility for letting it go on as long as it did. Now we have a chance to make it right." "What are you proposing?" Old Man Peterson asked. "A rotation, people willing to help watch the mercantile, escort Clara if she needs to go somewhere, make sure she's never alone and vulnerable. We also continue supporting the Marshes' business, counter the boycott Elias's friends have organized." "I can bring my husband and sons," said a woman Clara didn't recognize. "They're good with rifles, and they owe Granger nothing." "I'll spread word among my customers," Peterson added. "Let people know the mercantile needs business." One by one, the people in that room committed to helping. It wasn't a perfect plan, wasn't foolproof, but it was more support than Clara had ever had before. By the time the meeting ended, she was crying too hard to speak. Caleb walked the last of the supporters out, then returned to find Clara on the stairs, face in her hands. He sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. "You all right?" "I don't deserve this," Clara managed through tears. "All these people risking their safety, their businesses, for me. I don't deserve it." "That's the abuse talking. Elias spent 5 years convincing you that you're worthless, that you don't matter. He was wrong. You don't know that. You don't know me. Maybe I am." "Oh, Clara." Caleb's voice cut through her spiral, gently but firmly. "I know you survived 5 years with a man who tried to destroy you, and you're still here, still fighting. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." She looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was weathered, tired, marked by pain that matched her own. He'd lost a sister. She'd lost herself. And somehow they'd both ended up here, in this moment, trying to save something that everyone else had given up on. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. "Because someone should have cared about Anne. And since they didn't, I'll be damned if I let the same thing happen to you." It wasn't a declaration of love or heroism. It was just honesty, raw and painful, and somehow that made it more powerful than any grand gesture could have been. Clara reached out and took his hand. Caleb stiffened but didn't pull away. They sat there in silence, 2 broken people trying to figure out how to be whole again. The attack came 4 days later, on a Saturday evening when half of Red Hollow was at a town dance. Elias had planned it carefully, waiting until the protection rotation was thin and most people were distracted. Someone spotted smoke first, black plumes rising from the edge of town near the old mill. Within minutes, bells were ringing and people were running toward the fire with buckets and blankets. The town's small fire brigade mobilized quickly, Everyone focused on stopping the blaze before it spread to other buildings, including the 2 deputies watching the mercantile, who abandoned their post to help fight the fire. Caleb, returning from the ranch, saw the smoke and felt ice shoot through his veins. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. He broke into a run. The mercantile was quiet when he arrived, the front door locked, lights off downstairs. But something felt wrong. The air had that electric quality that comes right before a storm, and every instinct Caleb had honed over years of dangerous work was screaming at him to move faster. He took the stairs to the living quarters 3 at a time, heart pounding. Found the door to Clara's room standing open when it should have been locked. Inside, chaos. Elias had Clara pinned against the wall, one hand around her throat, the other holding a hunting knife. Evelyn was on the floor clutching her arm, blood seeping between her fingers. Thomas was unconscious near the overturned table. About time someone showed up, Elias slurred, clearly drunk but still dangerous. Was starting to think I'd have to finish this without an audience. Caleb's hand went to his gun, but Elias pressed the knife harder against Clara's throat. Don't! She's dead before you clear leather. Clara's eyes were wide with terror, her face pale. A thin line of blood ran down her neck where the blade had already cut her. Let her go, Caleb said, forcing his voice to stay calm, even though rage was boiling in his chest. Why would I do that? She's mine, been mine for 5 years. You think some piece of paper changes that? Elias laughed, wild and unhinged. I own her. Bought her with a ring and vows. She doesn't get to leave. The law says different. The law can go to hell! Elias's grip tightened on Clara's throat, making her gasp. I warned her, told her what would happen if she defied me, told all of you, but nobody listened. So now I'm going to teach everyone a lesson they won't forget. By killing her? Caleb took a slow step forward. That'll get you hanged. Don't care. If I can't have her, nobody will. Another step. Caleb kept his hands visible, non-threatening, even though every muscle was coiled to strike. You kill her. You prove everyone right. Prove you're exactly the monster they say you are. I'm not a monster. I'm her husband. I have rights. You have nothing, Caleb said quietly. You lost her the first time you raised your hand to her. Lost her respect, her fear, her obedience. All you've got left is violence, and that doesn't make you powerful. It makes you pathetic. Elias's face went purple with rage. You don't know anything about us, about what we had. I know she'd rather die than go back to you. That tell you everything? It was the wrong thing to say. Caleb saw the decision form in Elias's eyes a split second before he moved, saw him start to drive the knife toward Clara's throat. Caleb drew. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the small room, deafening. Elias jerked backward, the knife falling from his hand as he stumbled. But he'd already cut Clara, not deep, but enough that blood bloomed across her collarbone. Caleb fired again, this time hitting Elias in the shoulder. The man went down hard, screaming and clutching his wounds. Clara collapsed, hands going to her throat. Caleb kicked the knife away from Elias and moved to her, checking the wound quickly. Shallow. She'd be okay. He turned his attention to Evelyn, who was struggling to sit up. I'm fine, Evelyn gasped. He just cut my arm. Thomas, check, Thomas. Thomas was groaning, coming around. Blood matted his hair where Elias had hit him with something, but he was conscious. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. Sheriff Morrison and 6 men, drawn by the gunshots. They burst in to find Elias bleeding on the floor, Caleb standing over him with his gun still drawn, and the Marshes trying to help Clara. What happened? Morrison demanded. He broke in, Evelyn said, her voice shaking. Attacked Thomas, cut me, had Clara at knife point. He was going to kill her. If Caleb hadn't... Her voice broke. Morrison looked at Elias, who was conscious and glaring at all of them with pure hatred. Elias Granger, you're under arrest for attempted murder, assault, and breaking and entering. Anything you say, she's my wife, Elias screamed. My wife! I can't murder what belongs to me. That's not how the law works, Morrison said coldly. And even if it was, she filed for divorce. She's not yours anymore. 2 men hauled Elias to his feet. He fought them, still screaming obscenities and threats, promising revenge on everyone in the room. But the fight had gone out of him. Blood loss and pain and the dawning realization that he'd finally gone too far had broken something. As they dragged him away, Dr. Wright arrived and immediately began treating the wounded. Clara's throat wound was shallow, Evelyn's arm needed stitches, and Thomas had a concussion but would recover. You saved her life, Wright told Caleb quietly while bandaging Clara's neck. Another second, and that knife would have hit her artery. Caleb didn't respond. He was staring at his hands, which were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. He'd killed men before, in self-defense and in war, but it never got easier. And knowing he'd come within a heartbeat of being too late was sitting in his chest like a cold stone. I should have been here, he said, finally. Should have known it was a distraction. You couldn't have known. None of us did. Wright finished wrapping Clara's bandage. What matters is you got here in time. Barely. The word hung unspoken between them. Later, after the sheriff had taken statements and the doctor had patched everyone up, Caleb sat outside the mercantile watching the fire crews finish putting out the blaze at the mill. It had been arson, as expected. Accelerant poured around the base, designed to burn fast and draw attention. Elias had planned it carefully, timed everything perfectly. And it had almost worked. Clara found him there an hour before dawn, wrapped in a blanket Evelyn had given her. She sat down beside him without asking permission. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For being there. For keeping your promise. She touched the bandage on her throat. For saving my life. I almost didn't. Was too slow, but you weren't. Clara took his hand again the way she had on the stairs days ago. You were exactly fast enough, and I'm alive because of it. Caleb looked at her. This woman who'd survived 5 years of hell and was still finding the strength to comfort someone else. He was going to kill you, really kill you. I saw it in his eyes. I know. I saw it too. Clara's voice was steady despite what she'd just been through. That's why I finally understand what you've been trying to tell me. That leaving wasn't the dangerous choice. Staying was. If I'd gone back to him, if I'd given in, he would have killed me eventually anyway. At least this way I have a chance. You have more than a chance. He's going to prison. Morrison told me they're charging him with attempted murder, arson, multiple counts of assault. With the evidence Dr. Wright compiled and what happened tonight, no judge is going to let him walk. And the divorce? Should go through without contest now. Hard for a man to fight a divorce petition from a jail cell. Clara nodded slowly, processing this. 5 years of marriage ending in blood and violence and a smoking building at the edge of town. It wasn't the freedom she'd imagined, wasn't clean or simple or satisfying, but it was freedom nonetheless. What happens now, she asked. Now you heal. You wait for the judge's ruling. You figure out who you are when you're not afraid anymore. Caleb squeezed her hand gently. Now you get to live, Clara. Really live. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together watching the sun come up over Red Hollow, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of pink and gold. The town was different now, changed by violence and courage and the simple act of people deciding to give a damn. Clara was different too. Still scared, still marked by what she'd survived, but no longer alone, no longer helpless. And somewhere in a cell at the sheriff's office, Elias Granger sat bleeding and defeated. His empire of fear finally crumbled to dust. The trial was set for 3 weeks after the attack, which gave Elias just enough time to heal from his gunshot wounds and not nearly enough time for Clara to prepare herself for facing him in a courtroom. Judge Nathaniel Burke arrived in Red Hollow on a Wednesday, a stern-faced man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He set up court in the town hall, the largest building available, and word spread fast that he wasn't interested in wasting time. I've reviewed the petition and the evidence Dr. Wright sent ahead, Burke told the assembled parties during the preliminary hearing. This case involves serious allegations of sustained abuse and an attempted murder charge that's being handled separately by the territorial prosecutor. I'll hear testimony from both sides, but I want it understood from the start that I have no patience for theatrics or time wasting. We're here to determine whether Mrs. Granger has grounds for divorce, nothing more. Elias sat at the defendant's table with a lawyer he'd scraped together money to hire, a nervous young man named Porter, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Elias's arm was still in a sling from Caleb's bullet, and his face had the gray, haggard look of someone who'd been drinking heavily in confinement. He stared at Clara with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Clara sat between Dr. Wright, who was acting as her legal advisor, and Evelyn, who'd insisted on being there for moral support. Caleb was in the back of the courtroom, having been told he might be called as a witness. The room was packed. Seemed like half of Red Hollow had turned out to watch, some supporting Clara, others still loyal to Elias, and plenty just hungry for drama. "Mrs. Granger," Judge Burke said, looking at Clara over his spectacles, "you've petitioned for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. In your own words, tell me what that means." Clara's mouth went dry. She'd practiced this with Dr. Wright, gone over what she'd say 100 times, but now, with everyone staring at her and Elias's eyes boring into her skull, the words stuck in her throat. "Take your time," Burke said, not unkindly. She swallowed hard. "It means he hurt me. For 5 years he hurt me." "Can you be more specific?" Clara looked at Evelyn, who nodded encouragement. Then she began talking, and once she started, it was like opening a dam. 5 years of silence came pouring out in a flood of painful memories. She told them about the first time Elias hit her, 3 months after their wedding, when she'd burned the dinner. How he'd apologized afterward, cried, promised it would never happen again. How she'd believed him. She told them about the broken wrist, the fractured ribs, the concussion that left her dizzy for weeks. About being dragged by her hair and locked in a root cellar for 2 days without food because she'd spoken to another man at the general store. She described the constant fear, never knowing what would set him off. How walking on eggshells became second nature. How she learned to read his moods by the weight of his footsteps on the porch. "He told me I deserved it," Clara said, her voice cracking. "Said if I was a better wife, he wouldn't have to discipline me. And I believed him. I thought it was my fault, that I was the problem." "When did you stop believing that?" Burke asked. Clara looked back at Caleb. "When someone finally showed me it wasn't normal, that what he was doing was wrong, not something I'd caused. And that someone was Mr. Ryder, the man who shot your husband? He wasn't my husband anymore. Not in any way that mattered." Clara's voice grew stronger. "And yes, Caleb saved my life. Elias broke into my sister's home with a knife, planning to kill me because I dared to leave him. If Caleb hadn't been there, I'd be dead." Porter, Elias's lawyer, stood up. "Objection. Mrs. Granger is speculating about my client's intentions." "I had a knife to her throat," Clara shot back. "How much more clear could his intentions be?" Burke raised a hand. "Mrs. Granger has a point, Mr. Porter. Continue, ma'am." She told them about the night of the fire, how Elias had planned it as a distraction, how he'd beaten Thomas unconscious and cut Evelyn before coming after Clara, how he'd told her that if he couldn't have her, nobody would. By the time she finished, she was shaking and crying, and more than a few people in the courtroom looked sick. Judge Burke made notes throughout, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mrs. Granger," he said finally. "Dr. Wright, I understand you have medical documentation?" Wright stood and presented his evidence, photographs of bruises, written descriptions of injuries treated over 5 years, statements from other doctors who'd seen Clara after particularly bad beatings. The evidence was damning, clinical, impossible to dismiss. "Mr. Granger," Burke said, turning to Elias, "you have the right to respond to these allegations. What do you have to say?" Elias stood slowly, favoring his injured shoulder. His face was red. Whether from shame or anger was hard to tell. "She's lying." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "About which part?" Burke asked mildly. "All of it. She's making me sound like some kind of monster. I never—" Elias's voice rose. "I was a good husband. I provided for her, gave her a home, treated her well. She's the one who— Who what, Mr. Granger? Deserved to be beaten? She was disobedient, willful. A man has a right to maintain order in his household. By breaking his wife's bones? She's exaggerating. Those injuries were accidents, most of them. She's clumsy, always has been. Falls down the stairs, burns herself cooking. That's a lie." Clara stood up, trembling with fury. "You pushed me down those stairs. You held my hand over the stove because I didn't season your meat right." "You see?" Elias gestured at her wildly. "This is what I dealt with. A hysterical woman who twists everything, who makes herself the victim when all I ever did was try to be a good husband." "A good husband doesn't beat his wife unconscious," Burke said flatly. "A good husband doesn't require his wife to hide bruises under long sleeves in summer. A good husband doesn't attempt murder when she tries to leave." I wasn't trying to murder her. I was trying to bring her home. With a knife to her throat? Elias's lawyer put a hand on his arm, trying to get him to sit down, but Elias shook him off. She's my wife. Mine. We took vows. She swore to obey me, to submit to my authority as head of the household. That means something. It means you had responsibilities too, Burke said, his voice hardening. To cherish, to protect, to honor. Did you do any of those things, Mr. Granger? Elias faltered. I did my best. Your best involved fracturing her skull? That was an accident. Which time? Burke flipped through the medical reports. Dr. Wright documents 3 separate head injuries requiring treatment. 1 accident is unfortunate. 3 suggests a pattern. Elias's face went purple. You're twisting things around. You're making me sound like some kind of criminal. You are a criminal, Mr. Granger. You're awaiting trial for attempted murder, arson, and multiple counts of assault. The only question before me today is whether your wife has sufficient grounds to dissolve your marriage. Based on what I've heard, I'm inclined to say yes. You can't do that. Marriage is sacred. You can't just... I can, and I will, if the evidence supports it. Burke looked at his notes. I want to hear from other witnesses. Dr. Wright, you've already submitted written testimony. Is there anything you'd like to add? Wright stood. Only that in my 15 years practicing medicine in Red Hollow, I've never seen a pattern of injuries like Mrs. Granger's. The frequency, the severity, the obviously deliberate nature of many of them. This wasn't a clumsy woman having accidents. This was systematic abuse. Thank you. Sheriff Morrison? Morrison stood, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, I'd like to state for the record that I failed Mrs. Granger. She came to me twice over the years asking for help, and I dismissed her concerns. Told her it was a domestic matter, that there wasn't much I could do unless she pressed charges. I was wrong. I should have investigated, should have protected her. My failure doesn't excuse Mr. Granger's actions, but I want it known that the law failed her too. Burke nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty, Sheriff. It doesn't reflect well on you, but at least you're willing to admit fault. Mr. Ryder? Caleb moved to the front, his hat in his hands. He looked even more uncomfortable than Morrison. Tell me what you saw the day you intervened, Burke said. Saw Granger dragging his wife through the street by her hair, Caleb said, his voice flat. Beating her in front of the whole town. Nobody was stopping him. I did. Why? Because it was wrong. You didn't know Mrs. Granger. Didn't have any connection to this town. Why get involved? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Had a sister once. Her husband beat her. She died. Nobody helped her. Figured I wouldn't make that mistake again. I'm sorry for your loss, Burke said quietly. What happened the night of the attack? Caleb described coming back to the mercantile, finding Elias with a knife to Clara's throat, the decision to shoot. Wasn't a choice, really. He was going to kill her. I stopped him. Did Mr. Granger say anything that indicated his intentions? Said if he couldn't have her, nobody would. Said he was teaching everyone a lesson. Caleb's jaw tightened. Man was drunk and crazy and determined to hurt her. I did what needed doing. Thank you, Mr. Ryder. The testimony continued. Evelyn described years of hearing her sister's screams through the wall, of seeing injuries and being told lies about accidents. Thomas admitted his own cowardice in not intervening sooner. Mrs. Chen spoke about the culture of silence in Red Hollow, how women were expected to endure bad marriages without complaint. Old Man Peterson testified about watching Elias beat Clara in the street, about the town's collective guilt. One by one, people who'd stayed silent for 5 years finally found their voices. Porter, Elias's lawyer, tried to mount a defense. He called witnesses who testified that Elias was a good man, a hard worker, someone who'd never shown violence toward anyone but his wife. Thus, doesn't that tell you something? Burke interrupted. That he could control himself around everyone else but not his own wife. That suggests intention, not anger management issues. Porter floundered, trying different angles. Maybe Clara had provoked him. Maybe she'd been unfaithful. Maybe she was lying about the severity of the abuse to get sympathy. But every argument crumbled against the weight of evidence. The photographs, the medical records, the testimony of multiple witnesses. The simple fact that Elias had been caught in the act of attempted murder by 6 people. By the end of the first day, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Burke called a recess until morning. And as people filed out of the courtroom, the division in the town was visible. Elias's supporters looked grim and angry. Clara's looked hopeful, but cautious. Clara herself felt wrung out, like she'd been through another beating. Telling her story, reliving 5 years of pain in front of everyone, had taken everything she had. "You did good," Evelyn said, hugging her tight. "You told the truth. That's all you could do." "Is it enough?" "We'll find out tomorrow." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about what came next. If Burke granted the divorce, she'd be free. Truly free, not just hiding above a mercantile, but legally separated from Elias, with no obligation to return. But freedom was terrifying in its own way. She'd spent 5 years being told what to do, when to speak, how to act. The idea of making her own choices, living her own life, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. A soft knock at her door made her sit up. "Come in." Caleb entered, looking hesitant. "Saw your light on. Thought you might want company." "Can't sleep?" "Never can. The night before something important." He sat in the chair by the window, keeping a respectful distance. "You holding up?" "I don't know. Ask me tomorrow." Clara pulled her knees to her chest. What if he says no? What if Burke decides I haven't proven enough, or that I should give Elias another chance, or he won't? Not after everything he heard today. "You can't know that." "No, but I can make an educated guess." Caleb stretched his legs out. "Burke's no fool. He saw the evidence, heard the testimony. More importantly, he saw Elias lose his temper in court, saw him blame you for his own violence. That told him everything he needed to know." Clara wanted to believe him. "And if I'm wrong? If I have to go back?" "You won't." Caleb's voice was firm. "But if somehow Burke rules against you, we'll figure out another way. There's always another way." "Like what?" "Like you disappear. I take you somewhere Elias can't find you, somewhere you can start over with a new name." Clara blinked. "You'd do that? Help me run? If it came down to it?" "Yes." Caleb met her eyes. "I told you, not while I'm breathing. I meant it." Something warm unfurled in Clara's chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Why? Why do you care so much?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. "Because you remind me that it's not too late. That sometimes people do get saved, do get second chances. After Anne died, I spent a long time thinking I'd failed the only person who really mattered. Helping you, it's..." He paused, searching for words. "It's proof that caring about someone can actually make a difference. You didn't fail your sister. You didn't know what was happening. Maybe. But I know now. And I know that if I'd walked away from you in that street, if I'd let Elias drag you home, I would have failed her all over again." Caleb stood, moving toward the door. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, you're going to be free, and you'll need your strength to figure out what that means." After he left, Clara lay back down, her mind quieter than before. For the first time in 5 years, she let herself imagine a future beyond survival. What would she do with freedom? Who would she become when she wasn't defined by fear? The questions were overwhelming, but they weren't hopeless anymore. Court reconvened at 9 the next morning. Judge Burke took his seat, looking even more stern than the day before, and the packed courtroom fell silent. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented yesterday," Burke began without preamble. "I've also spoken privately with both parties to understand their positions. This is not an easy decision, nor one I take lightly. Marriage is indeed sacred, meant to be a lifelong commitment. But marriage is also a contract that requires both parties to uphold certain responsibilities." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Evelyn grabbed one and held tight. "Mr. Granger," Burke continued, "you stood in this courtroom yesterday and admitted, in your own words, that you believed you had the right to discipline your wife through physical punishment. You justified broken bones, bruises, and injuries by claiming she was disobedient. You showed no remorse, no understanding that your actions were wrong. In fact, you seemed to believe you were entitled to control Mrs. Granger through violence." Elias started to speak, but Burke held up a hand. "I've presided over divorce cases before. I've heard all manner of excuses and justifications. But rarely have I encountered someone so thoroughly convinced of their own righteousness while describing behavior that is, by any measure, cruel and criminal." Burke's voice hardened. "You don't deserve a wife, Mr. Granger. You deserve a prison cell." Hope flared in Clara's chest, bright and terrifying. "Mrs. Granger," Burke turned to her. You have endured 5 years of systematic abuse at the hands of a man who vowed to cherish you. You bear physical and emotional scars that may never fully heal. You have shown remarkable courage in coming forward, in refusing to return to your abuser, in trusting the legal system to protect you when it has failed you before. Burke opened a leather folder and pulled out a document. It is the judgment of this court that Clara Granger has more than sufficient grounds for divorce on the basis of extreme cruelty. The marriage between Clara Whitmore and Elias Granger is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others protested loudly. Elias surged to his feet, screaming obscenities, only to be restrained by Sheriff Morrison's deputies. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The word dissolved echoed in her head like a bell, drowning out everything else. Furthermore, Burke raised his voice over the commotion, I am recommending to the territorial prosecutor that Mr. Granger serve the maximum sentence for attempted murder and his other crimes. I am also issuing a permanent restraining order forbidding Mr. Granger from coming within 100 yards of Clara Whitmore for the rest of his natural life. You can't do this, Elias roared, fighting against the men holding him. She's mine. You can't just... I just did, Burke said coldly. And if you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I'll add contempt of court to your charges. Remove him. They dragged Elias from the courtroom, still screaming threats and promises of revenge. But his voice faded as they pulled him away, and what was left was silence broken only by quiet crying. Clara was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Free. She was free. Actually, legally, finally free. Mrs. Whitmore, Burke said gently, and it took Clara a moment to realize he was talking to her, using her maiden name. You are a free woman. What your former husband did to you was reprehensible, and the fact that it took 5 years for someone to help you is a stain on this community. I hope you find peace and happiness in whatever comes next. Clara tried to speak but couldn't get words out. Evelyn answered for her, thanking the judge through her own tears. After Burke adjourned, people swarmed Clara, some offering congratulations, others offering support or apologies for not helping sooner. Mrs. Chen hugged her tight, whispering about how proud she was. Dr. Wright shook her hand formally, his eyes suspiciously bright. Through it all, Clara kept looking for Caleb. Finally spotted him near the back, watching with something like satisfaction on his weathered face. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of what they'd accomplished together. Outside, the August sun was beating down as hot as the day Caleb had first stepped into the street to save her. Clara stood on the courthouse steps, blinking in the brightness, trying to adjust to a world where she belonged to nobody but herself. What now? She asked Evelyn. Now, whatever you want. Evelyn squeezed her hand. That's the whole point of freedom, Clara. You get to choose. The concept was still foreign, still frightening, but standing there in the sunlight with her sister beside her and Caleb a few steps behind, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. She felt hope. That night, Red Hollow celebrated. Not everyone. Elias still had his supporters, people who muttered about the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of women getting too independent. But enough people felt like justice had been served that the saloon did good business, and the general mood was lighter than it had been in weeks. Clara didn't join the celebration. She sat in her room above the mercantile, staring at her reflection in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back. No longer Mrs. Granger. No longer defined by her husband's violence, just Clara Whitmore, whoever that was. The problem was, she didn't know. Hadn't been Clara Whitmore in 5 years. Wasn't sure she remembered who that person was supposed to be. A knock at the door. It's me, Evelyn called. Come in. Evelyn entered with a tray of food. You didn't eat at dinner. Thought you might be hungry. Not really, but Clara accepted the tray anyway, picking at the bread without much interest. Ev, what am I supposed to do now? What do you mean? I mean, I've spent 5 years surviving. That was my whole life, getting through each day without making Elias angry, without getting hurt too badly, without dying. Now that's over, and I don't know how to do anything else. Evelyn sat beside her. You learn. Same way you learn to survive, you learn to live. That's not helpful. I know, but it's true. Evelyn took Clara's hand. You want my advice? Start small. Figure out one thing you want to do tomorrow that's just for you. Not because someone told you to, not because you're afraid of consequences, just because you want to. Like what? That's for you to decide. That's the whole point. After Evelyn left, Clara lay awake thinking about the question. What did she want? She'd spent so long not wanting anything, not allowing herself to hope for anything, that the question felt impossible to answer. But slowly, tentatively, small wants began surfacing. She wanted to sleep without nightmares, wanted to walk down the street without fear, wanted to sew again, create something beautiful instead of constantly repairing what was broken, wanted to figure out who she was when she wasn't terrified. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first morning Clara woke up as a free woman, she forgot for a moment where she was. Panic seized her chest. Where was Elias? What had she done wrong? How bad would the punishment be? Before memory caught up. The trial, the divorce. The judge's voice saying dissolved. She sat up slowly, testing the reality of it. Sunlight streamed through the window. Birds sang outside. Downstairs, she could hear Thomas opening the mercantile for business. Normal sounds on a normal morning, except nothing would ever be normal again. That thought should have been frightening. Instead, it felt like possibility. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a simple blue dress Evelyn had given her. Her own clothes, the ones from her marriage, were still at the house she'd shared with Elias. She didn't want them back, didn't want anything that carried memories of those 5 years. When she came downstairs, Evelyn was sorting through fabric bolts, and Caleb was on the porch reading a newspaper. He'd started staying closer to town after the attack, sleeping in the mercantile's back room so he could respond faster if needed. Even with Elias in jail awaiting sentencing, nobody wanted to take chances. "Morning," Evelyn said, looking up with a smile. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than usual." It was true. For the first time in years, Clara had slept through the night without waking in terror. "What's that you're working on?" "Mrs. Patterson ordered new curtains, wants them done by next week." Evelyn hesitated. "Actually, I've been meaning to ask, would you want to help? You used to be so good with a needle." Clara's hands flexed involuntarily, remembering. "I don't know if I still am. Only one way to find out." It took Clara 20 minutes to thread the needle properly, her hands shaking too much to manage it at first. But once she started stitching, muscle memory took over. The movements were familiar, soothing. She'd forgotten how much she'd enjoyed sewing before Elias had beaten the confidence out of her. "That's beautiful," Evelyn said, watching her sister work. "You haven't lost it." "Feels like I have, like I lost everything." "Then you'll find it again, piece by piece." Evelyn sat beside her. "Clara, I've been thinking. Once you're ready, once you've had time to heal, maybe you could open your own sewing business. You're talented enough. People would pay good money for work like yours." The idea was absurd and terrifying and strangely appealing. "I don't have money to start a business." "We could loan you some, or you could work from here initially, take commissions, build up a reputation." Evelyn touched her arm. "I'm just saying you have options. You don't have to decide anything now. But when you're ready, there are possibilities." Clara looked down at her stitches, small and even, and felt something shift inside her chest. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of belief that she could be more than what Elias had made her. Over the following weeks, a rhythm established itself. Clara would wake without fear, help in the mercantile, practice her sewing. Small victories accumulated. She walked to the general store alone one day and didn't have a panic attack. She spoke to Mrs. Chen without apologizing for existing. She laughed at something Thomas said and didn't immediately feel guilty for it. Healing wasn't linear. Some days she felt strong, capable of facing the future. Other days, the weight of what she'd survived crushed her, and she could barely get out of bed. The nightmares came and went. Sometimes she'd see a man who resembled Elias from behind, and her heart would stop. But slowly, incrementally, the good days began outnumbering the bad ones. Caleb noticed. He watched Clara transform from the terrified woman he'd saved in the street to someone harder to define. Still scared, still marked by trauma, but fighting her way back to herself with a determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd known during the war. "You're staring," Clara said one afternoon, catching him watching her work on a dress commission. "Sorry, just thinking." "About what?" Caleb considered how much truth to share. "About how you're different than when we met. Stronger." "I don't feel stronger. I feel like I'm barely holding it together most days." That's what strength looks like sometimes. Not being fearless, just refusing to quit. He leaned against the doorframe. You know, when I first saw you in that street, I thought you were broken. Thought I'd be protecting someone too damaged to ever really recover. Clara's hand stilled on the fabric. And now? Now I think I was an idiot. You weren't broken. You were surviving the only way you knew how. There's a difference. Something passed between them in the quiet that followed, some acknowledgement of the bond they'd formed through violence and fear and stubborn hope. It wasn't romance exactly, not yet. More like recognition. Two people who'd both been shaped by loss, learning to see each other clearly. Thank you, Clara said finally, for not giving up on me even when I'd given up on myself. Wouldn't have been much of a promise if I'd quit at the first sign of difficulty. Caleb pushed off from the doorframe. I'm heading to Harrison's ranch. Need anything before I go? Just for you to come back safe. Always do. After he left, Clara sat holding the dress she was working on, thinking about the strange shape her life had taken. A month ago, she'd been convinced she'd die at Elias's hands. Now she was sitting in her sister's mercantile, sewing for money, making plans for a future that actually existed. The trial for Elias's attempted murder charge came 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Clara didn't attend. Couldn't bear to see him again, to hear him blame her for his own violence. But Caleb went, wanting to see justice served for Anne as much as for Clara. The trial was brief. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. Elias's lawyer tried to argue temporary insanity, claimed his client had been driven mad by his wife's betrayal. The prosecutor destroyed that defense by pointing out the premeditation involved in setting the fire as a distraction. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Judge Burke, who'd stayed in Red Hollow specifically to preside over this case, sentenced Elias to 15 years in the territorial prison. With good behavior, he might serve 12. Either way, he'd be an old man when he got out, broken and irrelevant. Do you have anything to say before sentencing is carried out? Burke asked. Elias stood, chains rattling. For a moment, Caleb thought he might apologize, might show some glimmer of understanding about what he'd done. Instead, Elias said, "This is all her fault, Clara's. She destroyed my life because she couldn't be a proper wife. When I get out, she'll regret what she's done to me. She'll—" "That's enough," Burke interrupted, his voice like iron. "Mr. Granger, in all my years on the bench, I have rarely encountered someone so thoroughly devoid of remorse or self-awareness. You blame your victim for your crimes. You show no understanding that you and you alone are responsible for your actions. Frankly, 15 years isn't enough, but it's what the law allows. Use that time to reflect on the kind of man you've become, though I suspect you'll waste it nurturing grievances instead." They took Elias away, still cursing Clara's name, still convinced he was the wronged party. Caleb watched him go and felt nothing but pity. Not for Elias, the man deserved everything he got, but for the pathetic waste of a life spent believing violence equaled strength. When Caleb returned to Red Hollow and told Clara about the sentencing, she didn't cry or celebrate. She just nodded slowly, processing. 15 years, she said. I'll be in my 40s when he gets out. You'll be older and wiser and living a life he can't touch, Caleb corrected. The restraining order is permanent. He comes near you when he's released, he goes right back to prison. What if he doesn't care? What if he comes after me anyway? Then I'll still be here. Caleb said it simple and certain, like a fact of nature. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the weathered cowboy to the man who'd upended his entire life for a stranger. Why? You've done what you promised. I'm safe, free. You could move on. Could, Caleb agreed. Don't want to. Why not? He was quiet for a long moment, choosing words carefully. When Anne died, I thought I'd never forgive myself. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life carrying that guilt. But helping you, watching you fight your way back to yourself, it's shown me that maybe redemption isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about making sure the next person doesn't break. I'm not your redemption, Caleb. No, you're just Clara. And I'd like to stick around and see who that turns out to be if you'll let me. Clara's throat tightened. She'd spent 5 years with a man who'd claimed to love her while destroying her piece by piece. The idea of trusting another man, of letting someone close enough to hurt her again, was terrifying. But Caleb had proven himself in ways Elias never had, patient where Elias was volatile, gentle where Elias was cruel, present without being possessive. I'm not ready for... Clara gestured vaguely, unable to name what she wasn't ready for. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. That's fine. I'm not asking for anything except to be around, as a friend, if that's all you want, as more, if you ever get there. No pressure, no expectations. Just let me stay. It wasn't a declaration of love or a demand for commitment. It was an offer of companionship with no strings attached. And somehow, that made it safer than any promise Elias had ever made. Okay, Clara whispered. You can stay. Time moved differently once Clara stopped measuring her life in survival intervals. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The seasons changed, and with them, Clara changed too. She opened her sewing business in a small room Thomas had cleared out at the back of the mercantile. Started small with repairs and simple alterations, but word spread about her skill. Soon she was taking commissions for dresses, suits, baby clothes. Women who'd watched her suffer for years now brought her their business, a silent apology in the form of payment for services rendered. Mrs. Chen became one of her best customers and closest friends. They'd sit together while Clara fitted dresses, talking about everything and nothing. One afternoon, Mrs. Chen said quietly, "My mother would have loved you. She spent her whole life wishing she'd been brave enough to leave. You did what she couldn't." I didn't feel brave, Clara admitted, pinning a hem. I felt terrified. Brave and terrified aren't opposites. They're usually the same thing. Mrs. Chen touched the fabric Clara was working on. You know there are other women in town who are suffering like you did, who see what you accomplished and wonder if they could do it too. Clara's hand stilled. Do you know someone who needs help? Maybe. If I did, would you talk to her? Of course. That conversation led to others. Quietly, carefully, Clara began helping women who were trapped the way she'd been. She'd meet them in the back room of the mercantile, listen to their stories, help them understand that abuse wasn't normal or deserved, connected them with Dr. Wright for documentation, with Sheriff Morrison for protection, with lawyers who could help them file for divorce. Not all of them left their husbands. The fear was too great, or the circumstances too complicated, or they simply weren't ready. Clara understood. She'd spent 5 years not ready before Caleb had forced the issue by stepping into that street. But some did leave. Some found the courage to say no, to file petitions, to rebuild their lives. And each one who succeeded felt like another brick in the wall Clara was building between herself and the woman she'd been. Caleb watched this transformation with quiet pride. He'd continued working at Harrison's ranch, proving himself valuable enough that the old man made him co-manager within a year. The work was hard but honest, and it gave Caleb a sense of purpose he hadn't had in years. He and Clara developed an easy friendship built on mutual respect and shared trauma. He'd stop by the mercantile after work, and they'd talk about their days. Sometimes he'd help her with heavy lifting or escort her when she needed to go somewhere. Other times they'd just sit in comfortable silence, two people who understood what it meant to carry scars. Slowly, carefully, that friendship deepened into something else. It started with small things, Clara laughing at one of Caleb's rare jokes, her hand brushing his when he passed her a tool, the way her face lit up when he walked into a room. Caleb felt it too, the pull toward this woman who'd survived hell and come out the other side fighting. But he never pushed, never demanded more than Clara was ready to give. He'd seen what happened when men treated women as possessions instead of people, and he'd be damned if he repeated that mistake. 2 years after the divorce, Clara invited Caleb to dinner. Not at the mercantile, but at the small house she'd rented with money from her sewing business. It was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was hers, the first space she'd ever owned outright. "This is nice," Caleb said, looking around at the simple furniture and the curtains Clara had made herself. "Feels like you." "You don't even know what that means. I'm still figuring it out myself." But Clara smiled as she said it. "Sit. Dinner's almost ready." They ate beef stew and biscuits, talking about nothing important. The new foal at Harrison's ranch, Mrs. Patterson's latest impossible sewing request, the upcoming election for sheriff, where Morrison was running unopposed after people had finally forgiven him for his years of inaction. After dinner, they sat on Clara's small porch watching the sunset. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said finally. "Always. Why haven't you tried to kiss me or court me properly? It's been 2 years, Caleb. I know you care about me. I can see it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted you to be sure, not just that you want me, but that you're ready to want anyone. There's a difference. And if I said I'm ready, are you? Clara thought about it honestly. 2 years ago, the idea of being touched by any man would have sent her into panic. A year ago, she'd still flinched when someone moved too quickly near her. But now, sitting beside Caleb in the warm evening air, she felt safe. More than safe. She felt wanted in a way that didn't make her feel owned. I think so, she said carefully. I'm not the same person I was when we met. I'm not even the same person I was 6 months ago. But I know I care about you, and I know I trust you in a way I've never trusted anyone. That's not the same as being ready for more. No, but it's a start. Clara turned to face him. I'm not asking for promises or commitments, Caleb. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to try, slowly, on my terms. Caleb studied her face in the fading light, seeing the woman she'd become. Strong where she'd been broken, confident where she'd been terrified, whole where she'd been shattered. She wasn't perfect, still had nightmares sometimes, still struggled with trust issues, still carried scars both visible and invisible. But she was Clara, and that was more than enough. Your terms, he agreed quietly, whatever you need. Their first kiss happened 3 weeks later, on Clara's porch after another dinner. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the violent passion Elias had demanded. When Clara pulled back, her eyes were wet. I didn't know it could be like this, she whispered. Soft. Safe. It should always be like this. Caleb brushed a tear from her cheek. You deserve soft and safe, Clara. You always did. They took it slow. Caleb never stayed the night, never pushed for more than Clara offered. He let her set the pace, respected her boundaries, proved through action that love didn't have to mean control. It took another year before Clara felt ready for more, and even then it was awkward and fumbling, and nothing like the romance novels Evelyn sometimes read. But it was theirs, built on trust and patience and mutual respect, and that made it perfect in its imperfection. 3 years after the divorce, Caleb proposed. Not with grand gestures or public declarations, but quietly over breakfast one morning at Clara's house. I've been thinking, he said, pushing eggs around his plate, about us, about the future. Clara looked up from her coffee. And I'd like to marry you, if you'll have me. He met her eyes. But I want you to understand something first. This wouldn't be like your marriage to Elias. Wouldn't be about ownership or obedience or any of that. It'd be a partnership. Equal say in decisions. Your money stays yours. Your business stays yours. You'd keep your independence. Then why marry at all? Because I love you. Because I want to build a life with you, not control you. Because after everything you've survived, you deserve to know what marriage looks like when it's done right. Clara's hands trembled around her cup. The idea of marrying again, of giving any man that legal power over her life, was terrifying. But this was Caleb. The man who'd stepped into a dusty street and changed everything, who'd proven over 3 years that he meant every promise he made. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Take all the time you need. I'll still be here. She thought about it for 2 months, wrestling with fear and hope in equal measure. Talked to Evelyn, to Mrs. Chen, to the other women she'd helped escape bad marriages. Weighed the risk against the reward. In the end, it came down to a simple truth. Elias had taken 5 years of her life through fear and violence. She refused to let him take the rest by making her too scared to trust anyone. Yes, she told Caleb one evening, but on one condition. Name it. Promise me that if I ever say no to something, you'll respect it, that my voice matters, that I stay free even if I'm married. Caleb took her hands. Clara, you'll always be free. That's the whole point. I'm not asking you to be mine. I'm asking to be yours. There's a difference. They married in the spring of 1883, 4 years after Caleb had first stepped into that dusty street. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself, pale yellow instead of traditional white, because she'd decided her second marriage would be nothing like her first. Judge Burke performed the ceremony, having stayed in touch with Clara over the years. Do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man to be your husband in a union of equals built on respect and love? I do. And do you, Caleb Ryder, promise to honor Clara's independence, to be her partner rather than her master, To prove every day that marriage can be something beautiful? I do. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife, and may you both find the happiness you've earned. The kiss was soft and sweet, and when Clara pulled back, she was crying, but this time they were tears of joy, not fear. The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect, life never is, but good. Caleb became a full partner in Harrison's ranch when the old man retired, turning it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Claire's sewing business grew until she had to hire 2 assistants to keep up with demand. Together they built a life that was quiet and steady and infinitely precious because they both knew how easily it could have been lost. They had children eventually, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up understanding that love meant respect, that strength meant gentleness, that being a man didn't mean dominating the people around you. Caleb taught his son to protect without possessing, to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. Clara taught her daughters that they didn't have to accept abuse, that they had value beyond what any man decided to give them. The work Clara had started helping abused women continued and expanded. She turned the back room of the mercantile into an unofficial shelter, helping women and children escape bad situations. Some people criticized her for it, said she was breaking up families. She ignored them. She'd learned the hard way that some families deserved to be broken up. Red Hollow changed too. Sheriff Morrison, who'd found his spine too late to save Clara but early enough to help others, became an advocate for protecting women from domestic violence. Dr. Wright compiled his medical records into a presentation he gave at other towns, teaching doctors how to recognize signs of abuse. Even the law slowly shifted, becoming more willing to protect women who fought back against violent husbands. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. But it was progress. Elias served his 15 years and was released in 1894, a broken old man who'd wasted his entire sentence nursing hatred instead of seeking redemption. He tried to return to Red Hollow, but the restraining order held firm. Sheriff Morrison escorted him to the county line and told him never to come back. Clara was 42 when she heard Elias had died in a neighboring town, drunk and alone in a boarding house. She felt nothing when she got the news. No relief, no satisfaction, no closure. Just a distant acknowledgement that a chapter of her life was finally, truly closed. "You okay?" Caleb asked that evening. "Yeah, I am." Clara looked around at their home, at the life they'd built together. "He took 5 years from me. But I've had 25 years since then. Good years. Years where I got to be myself, to build something meaningful, to love and be loved without fear. He lost. I won." "Damn right you did." They sat on their porch that evening, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while the sun set over the ranch. Clara's hands, once clumsy from fear, were steady now, worn smooth by decades of creating beauty from fabric. Caleb's hair had gone gray, his face even more weathered, but his eyes were still sharp and kind. "You ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Stepping into that street all those years ago? Your whole life changed because you decided to help a stranger." Caleb considered the question seriously. "Regret? No. It was the best decision I ever made. Not just because I found you, but because I proved to myself that I could be the person I wanted to be, the person Anne deserved to have, helping her. You think she'd be proud of who you became? I think she'd be glad someone finally stood up when it mattered." Caleb took Clara's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "And I think she'd love you, for your strength, your courage, your refusal to stay broken." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their grandchildren chase each other across the grass. One of her daughters was teaching the youngest girl to sew, passing down skills and strength in equal measure. Her son was showing his boys how to gentle a horse with patience instead of force. This was her legacy. Not the abuse she'd survived, but the life she'd built afterward. The women she'd helped. The children she'd raised to be better than the generation before. The quiet revolution of teaching people that love didn't have to hurt. "Tell me something," Clara said quietly. "If you could go back to that day, knowing everything that would happen, the violence, the trial, the years of healing, would you still do it? Would you still step into that street?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "Every single time, 1,000 times over, because you deserve to be saved, Clara, and because some things are worth fighting for even when the fight costs everything." "What things?" "The belief that one person can make a difference, that evil doesn't have to win, that courage matters, even when you're terrified. He squeezed her hand. That love, real love, is about giving freedom, not taking it away. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same sky that had watched Elias drag Clara through the street all those years ago, the same sky that had witnessed Caleb step forward when everyone else stood frozen. The world kept turning. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still being written, one choice at a time, one person standing up when it would be easier to look away. Clara had learned that the hard way, had learned that survival wasn't the same as living, that freedom had to be claimed rather than given, that the strongest people weren't the ones who never fell, but the ones who got back up. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemy. It was surviving long enough to build a life so full and beautiful that they became irrelevant. And she'd learned that love, real love, felt nothing like what Elias had called it. Real love was Caleb waiting 3 years before their first kiss, was respecting her boundaries, was building her up instead of tearing her down, was proving every single day that she mattered. As darkness fell and the children's laughter faded into the house for dinner, Clara thought about all the women who were still where she'd been, still trapped, still terrified, still convinced there was no way out. She couldn't save them all, but she could be proof that escape was possible, that the other side of fear existed, that broken things could heal if given time and safety and love. Tomorrow, she'd return to her sewing business, to helping the latest woman who'd shown up at her door with bruises and hope in equal measure. Tomorrow, she'd continue the work she'd started the day Judge Burke declared her free. But tonight, she'd sit beside the man who'd saved her life by refusing to walk past her suffering, the man who'd taught her that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not walking away. For keeping your promise. For showing me what love looks like when it's real." Caleb pulled her closer, and they sat together under the emerging stars, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something beautiful anyway. Because that was the thing about hope. It didn't require perfect conditions or guaranteed outcomes. It just required someone willing to fight for it. And on a dusty street in Red Hollow, on a scorching afternoon in 1879, a stranger had decided that one woman's life was worth fighting for. Everything else had followed from that single moment of courage. Everything.